Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. You guys want to know more about the effects of social media on modern life. So we're going to dig into this podcast called English Conversations, Social Media and Marriage.
Oh, yeah, interesting title.
Yeah, right. It's a bit more than I expected.
So is it like just one long conversation or?
Actually, no, it's two separate conversations.
Okay.
One that kind of zooms out and looks at social media's impact just in general, and then another one that focuses specifically on marriage trends and how social media is playing a role there.
Wow. Okay, so we've got like social media addiction, the whole like doom scrolling thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And then how it's changing the way people think about marriage.
Yeah, and even some pretty unexpected perspectives on arranged marriages too. So
Oh, wow. Okay, I'm intrigued.
yeah, this is going to be a good one.
Okay, let's dive in.
One of the first things that jumped out at me from the podcast was just how relatable it was right from the start.
Oh, yeah.
They talked about that feeling of, suddenly realizing, wow, I just spent like 3 hours on social media and like, what did I even do?
Oh my gosh, yes.
Like that feeling of just completely wasted time.
Yeah, it's like you get sucked in and then you come up for air and you're like, wait, what have I been doing?
Right. And I think almost everyone can relate to that. Like it really highlights how addictive these platforms can be.
Absolutely. It's like we all know it's happening, but we still can't seem to break free.
Yeah. And they actually use the term addiction in the podcast, which I think is pretty accurate.
I think so too. I mean, it checks all the boxes, right?
Totally. But what I appreciated is that they don't just leave you hanging with that feeling of helplessness.
Right?
They offer some actual strategies for regaining control over your social media use.
Okay, so like what kind of stuff are they talking about?
Well, they mentioned setting time limits, which is a good starting point.
Yeah, especially with all the tools our phones have now to help us do that.
Exactly. But what really resonated with me was this concept of mindful consumption.
Mindful consumption. Okay, I'm not sure I've heard that before.
So it's the idea that you're not just passively consuming whatever's thrown at you.
Okay,
You actually have the power to choose what you see and what you engage with.
I like that. Yeah, that makes sense. So how do you actually put that into practice, though?
Well, imagine curating your social media experience like you would a museum exhibit.
Okay.
Instead of just endless scrolling through a feed, you're intentionally seeking out accounts that align with your values and interests.
Interesting.
So you might prioritize accounts that educate you, inspire you, or offer diverse perspectives.
So it's about being really intentional about who you follow and what kind of content you expose yourself to.
Exactly. It's about shifting from being controlled by the algorithm to actively shaping your own online world.
That is powerful. I love that analogy of curating an exhibit.
Right. It puts you back in the driver's seat.
Totally. And speaking of taking control, the podcast shares a story about a student named Anna.
Oh, yes. Anna's story really stayed with me. Tell me what about her experience stood out to you.
Well, on the surface, it's a pretty familiar story of social media overuse.
Uh-huh.
Anna was a bright student, but her grades started slipping big time. It turned out she was spending hours on social media every day and neglecting her studies.
It's that classic tale of getting caught up in the scroll.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think there's more to it than just a lack of self-control.
Okay, I agree. There's a bigger picture here. What are some of the other factors that might have contributed to Anna's struggles?
Well, have you ever considered that the very design of social media platforms could be playing a role?
You mean with all the endless feeds and notifications?
Yeah, exactly. And all those dopamine triggering likes, you know?
You're right.
Research actually suggests that these platforms are engineered to keep us hooked.
It's true. And then you add in the immense social pressure young people face today
Oh, absolutely.
to present a perfect online persona. And it's no wonder someone like Anna might get caught in that web.
It's like a recipe for disaster in some ways.
Yeah, it really highlights that it's not just about individual willpower. There are these powerful forces at play that are exploiting our psychological vulnerabilities.
So if we're going to be mindful consumers like we were talking about earlier, we need to be aware of those external pressures.
Yes, 100%.
And the design elements that make it so hard to disconnect.
I think that's a great place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground already.
We have, but I'm really interested to hear what else this podcast has to say.
Me too.
Yeah.
Let's pick this up in our next deep dive session where we'll explore the surprising perspectives on marriage that you mentioned earlier.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to it.
All right, see you then.
See ya.
Okay, so we've been talking about social media and like all this stuff about algorithms and mindful consumption. And it's kind of crazy how it all ties into this next part of the podcast.
Really?
Yeah, they go into this whole discussion about marriage.
Huh, interesting. So, like, how does that connect to social media?
Well, it's all about how these individual choices we make, like who to follow online or, who to marry, are actually influenced by all these external forces too.
Okay, I see. That makes sense.
So they get into this whole debate about love marriages versus arranged marriages, and I gotta say they brought some really surprising perspectives to the table.
Oh, wow. I'm always fascinated by those kinds of discussions.
Yeah, me too. And what's so cool is that they present both sides in a way that really makes you think.
Yeah. Sometimes we go into those conversations with like our own preconceived notions and biases.
Totally. And this podcast really challenged me to reconsider some of my own assumptions.
So what was it specifically that like made you rethink your views?
Well, they had these two people with completely different viewpoints.
Okay.
Veronica was all about arranged marriages.
Yeah, okay.
She was saying that families are better at assessing compatibility and like upholding traditions and all that.
Hmm. That's interesting.
Yeah, it made me think about the value of involving family in such a huge life decision.
Right. Like maybe there's some wisdom in that collective approach.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about blindly following tradition, you
Hmm.
know. It was more about recognizing the potential benefits of having that support system.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But did they talk about the other side too, like the potential downsides of arranged marriages?
Oh, yeah, for sure. They didn't shy away from that at all.
Uh,
They acknowledged the importance of personal freedom and the whole excitement of falling in love and all
of
that.
course.
But then Veronica brought up this story about her friend who
Ooh.
went through this horrible breakup in college.
Oh, no.
And, like, this friend was a top student. But after the breakup, she had this total emotional breakdown.
Oh, that's so sad.
Her grades plummeted, and she even started thinking about hurting herself.
Wow. So it really affected her whole life.
Yeah, and it made me think, like, could involving family or a community have helped her? You know,
That's a good point.
like maybe having that support system could have provided a buffer against all that emotional turmoil.
Yeah, it's not about dictating choices or anything, but just offering guidance and support during those tough times.
Exactly. And it also raises the question of like whether our culture really prepares us for those intense emotional experiences.
Right. Like heartbreak is a real thing, and it can be so hard to deal with on your own.
Absolutely. So the podcast also introduces us to Robin, who's like a firm believer in love marriages.
Okay, so he's the counterpoint to Veronica.
Exactly. And he makes some really good arguments too.
Like what?
He talks about how love marriages allow for this deeper level of personal connection and understanding.
Yeah, I can see that.
Choosing a partner based on shared
Uh,
values, mutual attraction, and all that.
It's about building a life with someone you genuinely want to be with.
Right. But he also acknowledges that love marriages aren't without their challenges.
Oh, I'm sure there are plenty.
Yeah.
What kind of things does he bring up?
What mentions the whole love is blind thing.
Ah,
When you're so in love, you might overlook red
it
flags.
happens all the time.
Yeah. And he also points out that that initial intensity of romantic love can fade and that maintaining a strong marriage takes work and communication and all that.
So even in love marriages, there's this recognition that choosing the right partner is just the beginning.
Totally. It's about building a lasting relationship and being willing to navigate those ups and downs.
And it's interesting how it brings us back to that idea of individual choice versus societal influence.
I know, right? Like whether we're talking about social media or marriage,
It's all about finding that balance.
yeah, between what we want and the wisdom of those around us.
Yeah. It's kind of wild how this deep dive has connected these two things, social media and marriage.
I know, right? Like who would have thought that talking about scrolling and algorithms would lead us to all this stuff about love and relationships?
And like the role society plays in all of it.
It really shows how everything's connected, huh?
Totally.
Yeah.
Like whether it's the digital world or our personal relationships, we're always trying to figure out how much control we actually have.
And how much external stuff is influencing us.
Yeah, and how to find meaning and connection and all of it. You keep using this term individual agency.
Oh, yeah.
What exactly does that mean, like in this context?
So individual agency is basically our ability to make choices and take actions that shape our lives.
Okay.
It's about feeling like you have some control, even when there's all this pressure from society or whatever.
Right. So it's not about just doing whatever you want.
No, it's not about rejecting guidance or support.
Okay.
It's more about finding that balance between your own desires and the wisdom of people you trust.
So it's like finding that sweet spot.
Yeah, where you can make decisions that feel right for you,
Uh-huh.
but also taking into account the advice and support of your network.
And I feel like both social media and marriage kind of highlight how important that balance is.
I agree.
Like with social media, it's about realizing that those algorithms and all that social pressure can really mess with your head.
Oh, yeah.
And then once you realize that you can start making conscious choices about how you use those platforms.
Right. And with marriage, it's about understanding those societal and cultural norms,
Yeah.
that shape how we view love and relationships, but also staying true to your own needs and desires.
Yeah.
It's funny, I'm thinking back to that idea of mindful consumption.
Oh, yeah.
It's like that applies to our relationships too.
Totally. We can choose to be more intentional about the kinds of relationships we have
And who we spend our time with,
and how much energy we put into them.
right? Like just as we can curate our social media feeds,
We can curate our social circles, too.
surrounding ourselves with people who lift us up and support us.
It's all about making choices that align with our values.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge takeaway from this whole deep dive.
I think so.
Whether it's social media or marriage, it's about recognizing that we have choices.
We're not just passive bystanders.
Right, we can actively shape our experiences.
But it takes being aware of all those influences.
Yeah, the things that shape our perceptions and behaviors.
And then making decisions that feel authentic to us.
And I think the most important thing is to remember that we don't have to do it alone.
Absolutely. Having people we trust to talk to and learn from can make all the difference.
100%, whether it's family, friends, mentors, therapists, whoever.
Those connections are so vital.
So for anyone out there who's feeling overwhelmed by social media,
Or struggling in their relationships.
just remember you have more power than you think.
You really do.
You can make choices that align with your values and goals.
And you don't have to figure it all out by yourself.
Reach out, talk to people, find support, and remember that growth and change are always possible.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And as a final thought, I'd encourage everyone to think about this.
Okay.
What's one small step you can take today
Hmm.
to be more intentional and mindful in your relationships,
That's a great question.
whether it's online or offline?
Yeah, like maybe setting some boundaries with social media
Or having a deeper conversation with someone you care about?
or reaching out to a mentor for guidance.
Whatever it is, remember that even small changes can make a big difference.
It's all about those little steps that lead to a more fulfilling and connected life.
And on that note, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive.
Thanks for joining us, everyone.
We'll catch you next time.